stoked to be here tonight, and but when the idea first kind of came up when we got the email, I sort of said to myself, oh, sharing my artist story, not for me, that's not for me. Pass, thank you very much. And then the little voices inside started kind of chattering away at me, and I realized, you know, actually I do have something to share, because in my mind, my critical mind was kind of going, well, Marlene, you're self-taught, you know, your story's kind of boring, what have you got to offer? And I thought, well, what I would do is I would share my first, my most influential teachers, there's 3 of them, and I would share with you what I learned from those teachers as a way of sharing my journey. So this gentleman here is Mr. Bob Ross. He was my first teacher, and I met him when I was a teenager. And if you don't know Bob Ross, he had a television show on PBS that ran for decades called The Joy of Painting. And my dad was a huge fan, so Dad outfitted us both out with oil paints, and we would get together on Saturday afternoon, and we'd paint away to Bob, and we'd have to videotape Bob because, you know, he ran way too fast for us. So we'd have the VHS machine on stop-start, you know, and we would sort of follow on and make these nice little landscapes with Bob. And just to give you a little context at the time, as a teenager, I was a total metalhead, okay? I had super long fingernails, a perfectly coiffed mullet. My favorite band was Judas Priest. And my first art crush was actually Marc Chagall. So what was Bob Ross, you know, what did he have to offer and to teach me? And I'll tell you what it was. It was his idea of happy accidents. See, Bob had a half an hour of TV time to make you, you know, to teach you something, from white canvas all the way through to this lovely landscape. And, you know, as he's painting live, things are going to happen. Oopses are going to happen and mistakes are going to happen. And as they did, and he would just sort of turn, you know, a mistake of his into like a little happy bird, or maybe a happy bunny, or a happy branch on one of his happy trees. And I just realized, you know, I learned from him that just to keep going, right? To kind of roll forward, to find the positive. And that was a big message for me that I sort of kept on the canvas, and then of course into life as I, you know, ventured on. Now, I didn't go to art school, even though I loved painting with my dad. At least I didn't think I went to art school. It wasn't until I was preparing for tonight that I realized actually I did. I'm a product of the 80s. I'm an 80s girl. And yeah, so I knew there might be some of you here. So Much Music and MTV started airing in the early 80s. And like music videos were so cool and so sexy. And they were kind of pushing the envelope as to what that medium could do. And I was lucky enough to have a TV class in my high school. And I ended up going into post-secondary education for television, had a career in that industry. But even though I had a really great education there, we're going to have to sort of fast forward in my story another 15 years until I can introduce you to the second teacher of my story. And here you'll see me as a single mom. So it was a bit of a bumpy a ride, and I had with my 2 little girls. And I had come back to painting, sketching, and drawing as a way of sort of self-care. You know, well, that's the buzzword we're going to use right now, but actually at the time it was more like saving my sanity, let's just be clear. And I also kind of fumbled into the practice of yoga. I have really challenged hamstrings, so it was a really kind of love-hate relationship, but it was the philosophy of yoga that kept bringing me back in. And I became such a dedicated student that I actually ended up doing my teacher training when I turned 40. And that is where I met the second teacher of my story. And the second teacher of my story is actually an ancient text called the Bhagavad Gita. And the Gita is revered by Gandhi. You know, he lived his life by it. And it's this beautiful epic tale, but to just strip it down to its core, its essence message, the Gita is really about, we have the right, and actually we have the duty to show up and do our work in this world. But we don't have the right to the fruits of our outcome, of the outcome of our labor. And that's a pretty big concept for my Western mind to kind of wrap itself around. So this is how it kind of flows for me. I show up to do my work in the world. I show up to be who I am in this world. But I try really, really hard to let go of my expectations of how it's all going to unfold. So on the canvas, what's happening is I'm kind of having like a dialogue, right? A dance with the work in front of me. I'm trying to be very, very present to the work and react to what's happening in front of me as opposed to what I think needs to happen, right? So between the happy accidents and the letting go of outcome practice, I was starting to feel some really fabulous freedom of expression at the canvas. But there was still this kind of block in my story, this big sort of but in my story. And so the divine in its wisdom decided to offer me the third teacher from my story. And I met the third teacher just last summer, actually, on a road trip with my husband. And we were traveling through BC and Alberta, and we were doing some hiking, and we stopped in Jasper. We were planning to do a big alpine hike the next day. And but we had been driving, so we thought we'd just stretch our legs and go for a walk around the neighborhood trails just before we went for dinner. And just as we were heading back towards Jasper, my husband hears a sound, and he looks up, and he goes, "Bear." I look up, and just about freaking lost it. It was a grizzly bear. Okay, I'm a Sunshine Coast girl. I'm used to black bears. I'm kind of used to giving them the space and kind of know how they behave. Grizzly bears are a completely different story. This bear did not like that we had spotted it, and it started to charge. It was 150 feet away, and it started charging down towards us, towards the trail. There was no fight in the flight. It was all flight. I was like, oh my God, the sound of that animal coming down at me, it was tremendous, right? So I just started kind of like running, and then my internal voice and my husband's voice kind of chimed at the same time, and he said, don't run, don't run. I'm like, oh yeah, right, don't. So I turned around again, and the bear had kind of stopped, and was sort of looking at us. And that was all I could do. I couldn't stomach it anymore looking at the bear. I just started to kind of walk. And my husband was kind of walking backwards with his arms wide. And he watched this incredible, huge animal come down and go right onto the trail where he had just been standing. It turned and looked behind and then came back and sort of looked at us as we sort of rounded the corner. Now, thanks to that incredible experience with that bear, I have a new relationship with fear. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that fear is not with me. It is right here, right now. I can feel it. But I'm in the driver's seat, to paraphrase Elizabeth Gilbert, I have my hands on the wheel. So between my happy accidents from Bob and my letting go of outcome from the Gita and my beautiful bear experience, I feel like I have this incredible freedom in my art making. And I have this deep, deep joy in what I do. Even through the shitty parts. I know we like to swear. Even through the shitty, crappy parts. Even through the resistance and the days where you're just like, what am I doing here? Painting has been the most challenging gig I've ever done in my life. So I try to share that with as many people who will listen. I do workshops, I do retreats, I do, I even made a coloring book. But of course, it's coming through my artwork, right? It's coming through my paintings, it's the lessons I've learned from these incredible teachers. And the last slide you're going to see tonight is a painting that I did called Our Pulse. I did it last summer. And well, you're going to see it. There's happy accidents all over that baby. Maybe somebody's actually going to be able to find like a bunny in there, I'm sure, from Bob. And process. Process has become my goddess. I worship the idea, the practice of letting go of outcome, right? That kind of keeps me moving forward. And on this painting, there's sort of 3 white marks, and I think when I photographed that entire series last summer, I started to realize that there was this, this repetitive mark making on all those paintings from last summer, and I think that was a bit of a tribute to my last great teacher. It's funny how you don't see it till later, right? So I just want to thank you all for allowing me to share my story with you tonight, because I learned a lot about myself in the process of just kind of preparing for tonight. I learned that no one is really self-taught, right? I don't think we are. And I also learned that no one's story is boring. And I think as curators, it doesn't really matter what label we have or what our job description is. We are, as humans, we are creators, right? And so everything that we make, whatever medium we choose, it's our art that we share. And if we have the courage, I think with our art, when we put it out into the world, it can't help but be sort of reflections of little bits and pieces of our story. And I think if we have the courage, possibly, to share some of the precious stories, share some of the vulnerable stories, then maybe we allow for the opportunity for connection, right? And with connection, there's maybe this possibility for understanding. And for me, I think that, I'm going to tear up here, but I think that we could use a whole heck of a lot more understanding these days. So, namaste.